Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roche, Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, was born in 1757. Before his second birthday, his father, Michel de Lafayette, was killed at the Battle of Minden during the Seven Years' War. At the age of 12, his mother and grandfather died, leaving him a young, wealthy orphan. On April 9, 1771, at the age of 14, Lafayette entered the Royal Army. When he was 16, Lafayette married Marie-Adrienne Françoise de Noailles, allying himself with one of the wealthiest families in France. At a dinner on August 8, 1775, Lafayette heard the Duke of Gloucester speak with sympathy of the ongoing struggle in the colonies. He made clandestine arrangements with Silas Deane, a liaison between France and the colonies, to travel to America and join the revolutionary cause. Lafayette landed near Charleston, South Carolina, June 13, 1777, then traveled to Philadelphia, where he was commissioned a major general on July 31st. This reflected his wealth and noble social station, rather than years of battlefield experience. He was only 19 years old. The newly commissioned young general was soon introduced to his commander-in-chief, General George Washington, who would become a lifelong friend. Lafayette was wounded during the September 11, 1777 Battle of the Brandywine. In December 1777, he camped with Washington and the army at Valley Forge. As the Conway cabal unfolded, Lafayette sided with Washington. He wrote a long letter to Washington in which he pledged his loyalty. Washington replied, conveying his sincere appreciation for the Frenchman's support. General Horatio Gates had convinced Congress to appoint a board of war, over which he would have complete control. Knowing how loyal Lafayette was to Washington, Gates urged that Lafayette should command the expedition. Congress agreed to the campaign and gave Gates authority to work out the details. Gates wrote a letter to Washington informing him that Congress had approved the invasion of Canada and also that he had appointed Lafayette to command the expedition. Lafayette did not want to accept the appointment, but Washington overruled his objections and Lafayette reluctantly accepted. Lafayette traveled to York, Pennsylvania, which served as the capital from September 1777 to June of 1778, and began to carry out plans for the proposed expedition. On February 17, 1778, Lafayette rode to Albany, New York, the staging point for the Canadian invasion. The proposed Canadian expedition began to fall apart. It was clear to Lafayette that the troops and supplies at his disposal were inadequate. Other generals, including Schuyler, Lincoln, and Arnold, agreed. Compounding matters, Lafayette discovered that many of the troops he was to command were owed back pay, totaling over $800,000. In a letter to Washington dated February 23, 1778, Lafayette describes the grim situation. I have written lately to you my distressing, ridiculous, foolish, and indeed nameless situation. I am sent with a great noise at the head of an army for doing great things, the whole continent, France and Europe herself by and by. And what is the worse, the British army are in expectations. How far they will be deceived, how far we shall be ridiculized, you may judge very well by the candid account you have got of the state of our affairs. Lafayette then reveals his suspicions that the entire Canadian campaign and his appointment to lead it was nothing but a ruse to remove him from the area, the better to conspire against Washington. I fancy, between us, that the actual scheme is to have me out of this part of the continent, and General Conway in chief under the immediate direction of General Gates. How they will bring it up I do not know, but be certain something of that kind will appear. The Canadian invasion never materialized. As Lafayette speculated, the entire proposal was primarily a distraction with the objective of removing those loyal to Washington. In March 1778, Congress passed the following resolution on behalf of Lafayette's service: that Congress entertain a high sense of his prudence, activity, and zeal, and that they are fully persuaded nothing has or would have been wanting on his part, or on the part of the officers who accompanied him, to give the expedition the utmost possible effect. Lafayette returned to Valley Forge early in April 1778. The conspiracy to displace Washington had failed. Lafayette remained at Valley Forge, improving his knowledge of military tactics, until Washington marched out of Valley Forge to meet the enemy in New Jersey. The British evacuated Philadelphia on June 19, 1778. Washington pursued the fleeing enemy across New Jersey. Washington called a council of war at Hopewell, New Jersey, to discuss strategy with his generals. Charles Lee favored a policy of small targeted attacks and harassment. Anthony Wayne, Nathanael Greene, and Lafayette proposed a more aggressive campaign, beginning with a major offensive on the rear of the enemy. Washington accepted this plan, offering the command to General Lee, but Lee was certain the plan would result in disaster. Lafayette requested command of the advanced position, and Lee was happy to oblige, as he was convinced that defeat was inevitable. But Lee changed his mind, deciding that he wanted to command the perhaps not-so-hopeless expedition after all. He wrote to Washington on June 25, 1778, "When I first assented to the Marquis of Lafayette's taking the command of the present detachment, I confess I viewed it in a very different light than I do at present. I considered it as a more proper business of a young volunteering general than of the second in command in the army, but I find that it is considered in a different manner. I must entreat, therefore, after making 1,000 apologies for the trouble my rash assent has occasioned to you, that if this detachment does march, that I may have the command of it." Washington acquiesced to the mercurial general's change of heart, writing to Lafayette the following day, "General Lee's uneasiness on account of yesterday's transaction, rather increasing than abating, and your politeness in wishing to ease him of it, has induced me to detach him from this army, with a part of it to reinforce, or at least cover, the several detachments under your command at present. At the same time that I felt for General Lee's distress of mind, I have had an eye to your wishes and the delicacy of your situation, and have, therefore, obtained a promise from him that when he gives you notice of his approach and command, he will request you to prosecute any plan you may have already concerted for the purpose of attacking or otherwise annoying the enemy. This is the only expedient I could think of to answer both your views. General Lee seems satisfied with the measure, and I wish it may prove agreeable to you." The Battle of Monmouth, June 28, 1778. On June 28th, the American and British forces clashed at Monmouth Courthouse in central New Jersey. Lafayette performed ably. Lee, in command, did not. His troops were in disarray and in retreat. Washington managed to rally the American troops, relieving Lee of his command and placing many of his former troops under Lafayette's command. The Americans salvaged a partial victory from near defeat. The British managed to escape to New York, but lost their foothold in New Jersey and suffered heavier casualties than the Americans. Many on both sides died of heat stroke during the blisteringly hot battle. Lee was later court-martialed and found guilty on 3 charges for his dismal performance. On July 8th, the French fleet arrived under command of Admiral d'Estaing. Washington planned to use the French naval forces as part of a coordinated attack by land and sea on British-held Newport, Rhode Island, sending Greene and Lafayette with 3,000 troops to serve under command of General John Sullivan. On August 10th, the French and British naval forces clashed, but a severe storm damaged both fleets. The Americans on the ground could not launch an attack without the French naval support, the absence of which prompted many of the Americans to desert. D'Estaing brought his damaged fleet to Boston for repairs. Lafayette rode to Boston to plead with his countrymen to bring the fleet back to the siege of Newport, but D'Estaing remained unpersuaded. By the time Lafayette returned to Rhode Island, the siege had ended and the British had attacked the withdrawing American forces. Lafayette was instrumental in commanding troops during the strategic withdrawal. On September 9, 1778, Congress officially commended Lafayette, resolving that the President be requested to inform the Marquis de Lafayette that Congress have a due sense of the sacrifice he made of his personal feelings in taking a journey to Boston with a view of promoting the interest of these states, at a time when an occasion was daily expected of his acquiring glory in the field, and that his gallantry in going on Rhode Island when the greatest part of the army had retreated, and his good conduct in bringing off the pickets and out-sentries, deserved their particular approbation. Lafayette requested and was granted permission to return to France, arriving in February 1779, whereupon he was immediately arrested for having disobeyed the king, though he was hardly severely punished, serving only 8 days under house arrest in a hotel. King Louis XVI soon forgave the Marquis for his transgression, and shortly after his arrival, Benjamin Franklin's grandson presented him with a gold-encrusted sword, a show of appreciation from a grateful Continental Congress. On June 12, 1779, Lafayette wrote a long letter to Washington expressing his desire to help the American revolutionary cause. France has incurred great expenses lately. The Spaniards will not easily give their dollars. However, Dr. Franklin has got some money to pay the bills of Congress, and I hope I shall determine the government to greater sacrifices. Serving American is to my heart an inexpressible happiness. So insistent was Lafayette for aid to the Americans that one day Count de Maurepas said in the Royal Council, "It is fortunate for the king that Lafayette does not take it into his head to strip Versailles of its furniture to send to his dear Americans, as his Majesty would be unable to refuse it." In addition to procuring support from the French government, Lafayette personally purchased a large amount of supplies for the troops he would command on his return to America. France continued to send both officers and troops to aid the American cause. In 1780, Count de Rochambeau was appointed commander of 7,000 French troops who were dispatched to America. Lafayette again offered his services, sailing on the French frigate Hermione on March 19, 1780. Rochambeau and his expedition arrived in Newport on July 10th. In the early fall of 1781, Cornwallis and his troops were driven into Yorktown, Virginia. Surrounded by French and American forces on the ground, and with a powerful French navy cutting off escape by sea, Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. While the war would not officially end for well over a year, the crushing defeat of the British at Yorktown was celebrated by the French and Americans as an all-but final victory. Lafayette again requested permission to return to France. Congress granted the request, giving him a letter of appreciation for his invaluable services. Before he sailed for home, Washington wrote him a personal letter in which he said, "I owe it to your friendship and to my affectionate regard for you, my dear Marquis, not to let you leave this country without carrying with you fresh marks of my attachment to you and new expressions of the high sense I entertain of your military conduct and other important services in the course of the last campaign, although the latter are too well known to need the testimony of my approbation." On December 23, 1781, Lafayette sailed home from Boston on the frigate Alliance, bidding farewell to his beloved commander in a letter. "Adieu, my dear General. I know your heart sure that no distance can alter your attachment to me. With the same candor, I assure that my love, respect, my gratitude for you are above expression. That, at the moment of leaving you, I felt more than ever the strength of those friendly ties that forever bind me to you." In 1784, Lafayette visited America on Washington's invitation and was enormously popular as he traveled through each of the United States, returning again to France in 1785. In 1789, he was a representative for the nobility in the Estates General. By 1789, revolutionary fever was spreading throughout France. Lafayette was named the commander of the National Guard. On October 5th, a hungry Parisian mob descended on the palace of Versailles, demanding bread. Lafayette's charisma and his well-established sympathy with the common people helped to calm the crowd and allay their anger for the royal family. As the crowd shouted angrily at the unpopular queen, Marie Antoinette, Lafayette kissed her hand on a balcony. Lafayette's charm may well have saved the king and queen on that day, though they would not, of course, survive the revolution. As a nobleman who supported democratic ideals, Lafayette walked a thin line between two increasingly hostile camps. He had himself written the celebrated Declaration of the Rights of the Man and of the Citizen, but he did not support the complete overthrow of the established order, including the removal and eventual execution of the king. In 1792, when war was declared with Austria, Lafayette took command of one of the three French armies. He was captured and held prisoner until 1797. Lafayette reached out to his friends in the United States, including Washington and Jefferson. While the U.S. owed the Frenchman a great debt, they were unable to secure his release, though they did send money to make his incarceration more tolerable. Lafayette returned home in 1797, his release negotiated by Napoleon Bonaparte, at the time a powerful general, but soon dictator of France. When the news of Washington's death reached France early in 1800, Napoleon held a memorial service for Washington at Invalid, but Lafayette was not invited, and Napoleon ordered the orator not to refer to Lafayette in his oration. To the end of his life, Lafayette held firm for representative government in his country. The great general died in 1834. His tireless work for American independence will never be forgotten, and his name will always shine out on the pages of our history.